I heard the knock and I already knew. Mothers know things they have no logical right to. No. And I knew before I reached the door that the person on the other side of it was the one I had spent 5 years training myself not to wait for. Let me tell you what my daughter Melissa had done, because I am not interested in softening it. She had stolen from me across 3 years, not dramatically and not all at once, but in the slow, calculated way that addiction designs. 100 here, a piece of jewelry. There! The kind of theft that relies on your love and your disbelief to stay invisible as long as possible. She had lied to my face while looking me directly in the eyes, a skill I had not known she possessed until she turned it on me. And she had said things during one particular confrontation in my kitchen that I would not repeat here, that I had never heard from anyone who claimed to love me, words that landed with the specific precision of someone who knew exactly where I was most vulnerable because they had grown up watching me. I had given her chances, more chances than I should have, more than was good for either of us, because I was her mother and because I understood in the abstract that addiction was an illness and not a moral failure. And because every time she surfaced from the worst of it, with genuine remorse in her face, I found the part of myself that had held her as a newborn, absolutely unable to turn away. The last chance was the last one. I changed my locks. I stopped answering her calls. I chose, with full deliberateness and enormous grief, to survive. Here, 5 years is a long time. You fill it. I filled it with volunteer work at a literacy center too. Mornings a week and a small garden that became, if I'm honest, the most therapeutic project I had ever taken on. I filled it with my friend Gloria, who had watched the whole arc of the previous decade that and never once asked me to forgive before I was ready. I filled it with the specific, hard-won peace of a woman who had accepted that the price of her own stability was the absence of someone she had loved since before she knew what love cost. I was reading on my porch on a Saturday afternoon in early autumn when I heard the footsteps on the front walk. I looked up and there she was, thinner than I remembered, older, in the face in ways that 5 years alone couldn't fully account for. Standing at the bottom of my steps with her hands at her sides, like she'd rehearsed the position. And beside her, holding one of her hands, was a small girl with brown eyes, so familiar they stopped my breath entirely. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The little girl found a leaf on the walk and examined it with great seriousness, which was the most useful thing anyone did in those first few seconds. Melissa said she was sober. 14 months. She said she was not there to ask for anything, and she needed me to hear that clearly before she said another word. She said she had a daughter. Her name was Lily, and she was raising her present and clean and trying every day to be someone Lily could rely on. She said she had driven 3 hours that morning because she needed to stand in front of me and say she was sorry in a way that might actually mean something. Not the reflexive apologies she had offered during the bad years that were really just tactics, but something real, something earned, something that had taken 14 months of work to be able to say honestly. I want to tell you what went through me in that moment, but it wasn't simple enough to be told cleanly. It was fear, genuine and grounded, the kind that lives in specific memories rather than abstractions. It was grief for every version of this moment I had imagined and then deliberately stopped allowing myself to imagine. It was the voice of my counselor reminding me, as she had many times over the years, that there is a difference between staying protected and staying closed, and that only I could judge which one I was doing in any given moment. And then Lily held up the leaf she'd found and said, "Look," and I said, "Yes. That's a beautiful one." And she smiled the kind of smile that bypasses every adult complication and arrives somewhere entirely unguarded. I stood up. I opened the door. I said, "Come in. I want to be honest about the fear that walked in behind them. Because I think the story is dishonest without it." I had spent 5 years becoming someone who could live without Melissa in her life. And opening the door did not erase 5 years in an afternoon. I set limits, calmly and without apology, about what I was ready for and what I wasn't. And Melissa accepted each one without negotiating, which itself told me something important. I kept my counselor. I kept my eyes open. I did not confuse the decision to open the door with the decision to abandon every lesson I had learned behind it. What happened over the months and years that followed is the part of the story I find hardest to tell briefly, because it was slow and ordinary in a way that the dramatic preceding years were not. Melissa showed up when she said she would. She checked in before visiting. She shared her recovery progress without being asked. None of these were grand gestures. They were small, ordinary reliabilities. The currency of trust being rebuilt one unremarkable exchange at a time. And I recognized them for what they were because I had spent years understanding exactly what their absence had cost me. Lily grew. 3 years old became 4, became 5. She started calling me on ordinary evenings just to tell me things she had noticed during the day. A butterfly she'd seen, a book her teacher had read at school, the specific color of a sunset through her bedroom window. I answered every call, every time I did. I felt something settle a little further into place. The relationship between Melissa and me grew alongside it, carefully, with the particular pace of people who understand what they're rebuilding and why the pace matters. There were hard conversations. There were moments when old fear surfaced in me and I named it. Honestly, rather than pretending it wasn't there. Melissa met every one of those moments with steadiness, not with defensiveness, not with the old deflection I knew so well, but with the willingness of someone who had done enough of her own work to stay present when things got uncomfortable. I watched her mother Lily, and that more than anything else, reach the last defended place inside me. There is something in watching a person be genuinely present for a child. Really present, not performing it. That speaks to something beneath the adult layers of protection and history. What I saw in Melissa with Lily was exactly the person I had known. Here, to be capable of being. The version of her that the addiction had covered over for so long. I had begun to doubt it still existed underneath. I wrote about it eventually. In the essays I kept in a private notebook for the first year, essays I later shared with Gloria and my counselor and eventually with others who asked about the story. I wrote that the most important thing I had come to understand was the difference between forgiveness and permission. Opening the door to Melissa had not meant pretending. The previous decade hadn't happened. It had not meant trusting her automatically or abandoning the limits I had set or deciding that the 5 years of distance had been a mistake. It had meant making a considered choice based on the specific evidence in front of me that afternoon, to remain open to what was actually there rather than closing against what had once been. Forgiveness is not weakness. I want to say that clearly and finally, because I spent years afraid that opening the door would look like weakness to anyone watching, afraid it would look like I had allowed myself to be talked back into harm by someone who had caused me serious damage. That fear was wrong. Opening the door after 5 years of hard, deliberate work to protect myself was one of the most difficult things I had ever done. It required more honesty about my own grief, more willingness to remain uncertain about an outcome I could not control, and more genuine courage than most of the things I am proud of having done in my life. Lily is 8 years old now. She calls on Tuesday evenings just to talk, the same thing her mother once did in a different life. I answer every time. The strongest thing I ever did was not the years I stayed away. It was the afternoon I stood up from my chair, walked to my own front door, and opened it